Are you living the five? Welcome to Chapter 3. I'm Mr. Rodman, taking you through the top 12 highlights of American federalism. Glad you joined me. Let's talk about federalism for a second. This sharing of power between the national and state government, or the central and subdivisional governments, as what we talk about in the United States. The NSL, the national, state, and local government. We know the local is not in the Constitution. It is only the power that's given to it by the state government. So it's really national government, or the central power, and subdivisional governments, or the state powers, that are sharing that power. In terms of the different types of federalism that we see, dual federalism, think of it as that layered cake. You've got national government, state government, and the idea is that they kind of have their own separate spheres. In terms of the national government coins money, but the state government conducts elections and voter eligibility for those elections. Cooperative federalism, they're working together. It's kind of that Venn diagram where they're sharing space, and that sharing space, that cooperative piece of government, is really where they're working together on natural disasters or in times of crisis. Marble cake, when you've got a variety of issues and number of responsibilities that are sharing of powers in terms of the types of things that they're trying to cover. Maybe they're working on educational issues, but they're also working on disaster issues, and they're also working on providing monies and materials for better voter eligibility and better voting machines. So there's a mix of responsibilities there. And then permissive federalism, the idea that the power of what states have is dependent on the federal government. And a lot of this comes in the form of dollars, in the form of money that's actually shared with state governments in that capacity. Now, devolution, we talked about this kind of passing responsibility, or the power of government down from one level to another, is basically the idea that the national government wants to devolve the power of government and give it back to the states, return that power to the states. So we saw this in the late 70s, early 80s, during the Reagan Revolution. We saw a lot of devolution. We see a lot of that power being returned to states in that capacity. And basically, the first order devolution is the idea that's most central to it. The idea of national government passing it down to states so that they can carry out those plans. Second order devolution would be states passing it down to local governments, and then third order, the local governments passing it off to community organizations, charitable, philanthropic community organizations such as churches and other types of community events and organizers. And then something usually falls through the cracks, something happens, and then it becomes a much bigger issue and then rises to the level of the national government. Once again, new regulations put in place and the process starts all over. So that's essentially devolution. Now, the debate that we see today is between what level of devolution is appropriate versus where does the central government need more power. And so that really is a lot of the conversation that's taking place. When we saw the decentralists, the Jeffersons and the Reagans, taking place there in the 80s, or in the colonial era, but we also saw centralists, where Lincoln is trying to bring the country back together and try and repair the wounds of war. FDR trying to bring the country out of depression and try and bring everybody back together. So there are various aspects of this, but the crux of the debate is really about the centralized power versus decentralized power. Is there more power in the national government, or should that be something that is more in state governments? And we see a lot of that back and forth happening as presidents change and as Congress changes. Now, the power in a confederation or in a unitary government, the power is, as we see here, it's in the top. The unitary government has a strong central government. The national government has that power. In the confederation, we see the states have that power, and that really is the difference. In a federal form of government, that power is shared, and really that power of sharing of power is the idea of national and state working together. There are times in which national government may have more control or have more influence, and there are times when the states may have more power or influence as a result of that. So we see a lot of this kind of back and forth. The idea here is that there is no right or wrong. It's just a matter of what do we have. We have a federal form of government in which states and the national government do share power. But we also see a lot of unitary systems, France, Israel, China to some extent, Great Britain, a number of them that have more of the unitary approach. And then confederal, we saw that with the Articles of Confederation. We also saw that with the Confederate States during the Civil War in those times and those eras. Where states have more power, and we're seeing kind of a pullback from that in that there is either a federal form of government in which there's a sharing of power, or there's more stronger unitary or central government as a result. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to this idea of federalism. Obviously, an advantage is this is a way for people to experiment with what is going to work. Where should power be held? Should it be more in the state governments that hold that power, or the national government that holds that power and keeps that power closer to the people? It really depends on how the government is using it. How is the national government using that power? How are they sharing that power with the states? And how is the effect? How is the effect of the state government really sharing that power with the national government, and back and forth? Now, as you can imagine, this creates a lot of problems in terms of response time. We saw this with Hurricane Katrina. It's hard for the national government to respond when they don't know what's going on, when communication can be an issue. It's hard to hold people accountable. We had that in the team challenge. The issues of accountability are definitely at the forefront here. And then it's hard to see any type of standard in place. So we see a lot of those passed down by the national government. Education, for instance, but it's hard to enforce that when education is left up to state and local school boards in terms of carrying that out. And so we tend to see a lot of inefficiency as a result of that. And that's why No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds and the earlier forms of education acts really trying to reduce those redundancies and inefficiencies in those places. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of local governments in addition to just cities and counties. We see townships and school districts and special districts in addition that states are working with on a daily basis in trying to reduce those inefficiencies. And is there waste, fraud, and abuse? I'm sure there is on a number of levels, at all of those levels of government. But really, that's one of the experiments of federalism, is really to try and focus on how can we make government work better, how can we make government work smarter for the people and keep it in the power and in the hands of the people. Okay, so let's talk types of powers for a second. Delegated power, the idea that is enumerated in the Constitution. Article 1 says the powers that Congress has. Article 2, the power that the executive branch has. Notice the Article 1 much longer than Article 2. That's not just a coincidence. There's a lot more specific powers spelled out as the power that Congress has, and for a reason. There's a lot more leeway and room for the executive branch to kind of stretch their powers in Article 2. And we see, again, even a shorter version in Article 3 with the judicial branch. But there is supremacy. Article 6 tells us that there is supremacy and that the national government is supreme. State governments then have all the powers that are reserved that aren't spelled out in that national government, and some powers even that are denied. And we outlined those in class. And even some that are inherent or implied power, those that are shared. In looking at how this breaks down for the delegated and reserved powers. And again, we went over these in class, so I won't go and spend a lot of time here. You can look at the PDF or pause the video and take a look. But the idea here is the national government has specific powers that are spelled out for them, things like printing money and declaring war. Reserve powers, powers just that the states can do. The national government has no role, like conducting elections or issuing licenses. They do work together, however, in terms of how they share that power. Establishing the courts or building roads or borrowing money. All of these are ways that they would share the power. And then there are things that they cannot do. Well, first of all, they can't violate the Bill of Rights. The national government can't tax exports coming from states to another state. They also can't change a state's boundaries. The states can't coin money. They also can't tax imports or exports. And then they also can't suspend habeas corpus, the idea of due process. And the national and state governments have denied powers together. They can't grant titles of nobility. All of these are powers spelled out that are denied to government. And the founders and framers concerned about government overreach and beyond their powers. So implied versus inherent. We see the idea here is there are certain powers that, reading between the lines, we can see what is necessary and proper. Article 1, Section 8 spells this out. Kind of this elastic clause. It stretches in order to find the meaning. We looked at this in terms of McCulloch v. Maryland, the idea of what was necessary and proper in terms of Congress's ability to establish a national bank. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court, said they do have that power, but the state doesn't have the power to tax that bank because of Article 6, the supremacy clause. Inherent power is the idea that because the president is commander-in-chief, because the Congress has the power to ratify treaties, do they have the power to acquire new territory, to deal with foreign leaders? All of these growing out of the powers that they do have that are spelled out. So implied by other language in the Constitution, implied by that elastic clause. If you can create a national bank, can you collect taxes? Can you print money? Yes, yes is the answer to those questions. Inherent, does the president as commander-in-chief have the power to deal with foreign leaders and to go and propose treaties that the Senate would then have to ratify? Yes, that is an inherent power as the role of commander-in-chief, as the role of head of state that the president has in carrying that out. And being able to do so isn't necessarily spelled out as a power that's in the Constitution, but it is a power the president has when you read between the lines of what Congress what the Constitution is allowing the president to do. Now, keep in mind that really there's only 4 places that the national government has this power, and it is spelled out in the Constitution through the supremacy clause, that idea of Article 6, that the national government is supreme over any states, and we would see that played out with Andrew Jackson later on. The war power, the idea of the Congress declaring war, the president, commander-in-chief, they have a role clearly defined there in terms of what they can do in times of war. The Commerce Clause, we saw with U.S. v. Lopez, this is something that isn't always a national government power. Gun-free school zones isn't necessarily commerce. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. But it is something that Congress can look at in terms of trying to regulate commerce among the states and between the national government and other governments around the world. And then the Taxing and Spending Clause. And this is where we see the majority of legislation and the majority of power from our national government, from the Congress, from the legislative branch, and from the president and the executive branch. Most of their power is derived from these 4 places. It's coming from one of these 4 particular areas in terms of what power has been delegated to them. Now let's take a shift and look at mandates for a second. Don't overthink this. This is quite simple. Federal mandates, the idea of a funded mandate is the national government is telling a state you have to do something, and they're giving you money to do it. They're setting a deadline. Boom, you're done. An unfunded mandate, we're still requiring that you do it. There is a deadline, but we have no money. Sorry. Usually what happens is they start off as a funded mandate, and then ultimately they diminish in dollar value such that ultimately they become an unfunded mandate. And then, again, devolution starts to happen and set in as a result of that unfunded mandate. So again, no money, but the idea is you still have to carry it out. And that's where things fall through the cracks. That's where states then pass it down to local governments. Hey, you got to do this, got to carry this out. But then we start to see holes. We start to see problems. Let's talk interstate relationships for a second. So a couple of clauses here in terms of how states work together. The idea of full faith and credit is if there's a civil judgment against someone in one state, you're accepting records as valid. You're accepting the record of an individual in terms of the full faith and credit of your state transfers to that other state, and you would honor it accordingly. Privileges and immunities. The idea, if you are giving a citizen of your state a privilege, you would extend that to a citizen of another state that is visiting in your state. The only case that doesn't apply is in extradition. The idea of a criminal. They committed a crime, then they came to your state. By law, a state has an extradition agreement in which they would send that criminal or potential criminal back to the other state as part of extradition rules. And then we have interstate compacts. You think of the Chesapeake Bay. It's regional cooperation. They're agreeing with other states to try and work together in order to solve a common problem or an issue. We tend to see this as part of the as part of the Interstate Compact. Going back to full faith and credit for a second, this idea of licenses. Remember, states issue licenses. That's business licenses, driver's licenses, marriage licenses. And just because you have a license in the state of Maryland doesn't mean that I need to get a license in Virginia in order to drive in Virginia. The idea there is the full faith and credit of that state is that if I got a license in Maryland, I should be okay to drive in Virginia. That is the standard of full faith and credit. If I passed a test in Maryland, I should be able to drive on the streets and the interstates of Virginia, and likewise in D.C. or other places as we travel across the country. That's part of that full faith and credit clause. Now, let's just briefly talk about McCulloch. Again, we've got a couple of things going on here. Necessary and proper. Did the government have the right to establish a national bank? Answer, yes, they did. Under the idea of the necessary and proper clause, they did have the power to establish a national bank. Now the question is, does Maryland have the power to tax it? And that is where Article 6 kicks in, the supremacy clause, and the idea that no, they don't have the power to tax it because of the supremacy clause, the idea that the national government reigns supreme, and as a result, they don't have the power to tax that national bank. Then we get to preemption. Number 12, the idea of preemption when a national law is basically preempting or cutting short a state law or a local law. We see this happen a lot. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65 were good examples that basically preempted or nullified some of the laws that were passed in states that had black codes or Jim Crow laws. That's preemption. And again, it gets its power from the supremacy clause, the idea that if a national law kicks in, it is going to preempt or cut short those state laws that we see there. Gibbons v. Ogden, this idea that early interpretation using the Commerce Clause, does the Congress have the power to regulate commerce? And the Supreme Court said, yes, they do. They have the power to regulate waterways just like they regulate today interstates and commerce and commerce between the states and that sort of thing, and especially trade between the nation and other countries. So they do have the power to regulate commerce under that Commerce Clause. Looking at types of grants, we see here a categorical grant. That means you found a specific formula or a specific checkbox list, and you qualified for that particular funding. Versus a project grant, you're getting something for some type of research that's specific in science or job training or something like that. And then block grant is just a pot of money that's given to a state for education. Okay, I can spend that any way that I want to. Block grants give a lot more power to states than categorical or project grants because, again, the national government is giving away the money and not really telling you how you have to use it. So definitely very different in terms of the type of power that's being given to states here. Categorical, a lot more strings, a lot more attachments to the national government, and so they can kind of control how that money gets used. Block grants, just think of it as one big pot of money given to the states, and they can use it however they see fit. Very different in that regard, and we see a lot less of those today. A lot fewer block grants than categorical or project grants in terms of how those break down. So if you're interested in how much states give versus what they get back, for every dollar that they're giving, look at the states that are getting more back than they're actually sending to Washington. Maryland, not so. They're getting more than they give in terms of this to the tune of $1.30. Look at a state like New Jersey. It's giving $1, only getting 61 cents back in return versus New Mexico that's getting $2. Well, talk about an investment, return on investment. That's great. But the idea here is to show how much money is going to Washington and what it's coming back in the form of. That could be highway transportation, education funding, science, research, again, grants, block grants or categorical grants or other types of aid to states. And again, this is just more in terms of how you get back money in taxes, and you can take a closer look at that if you like. So some key events to close out this chapter. We're looking at the Civil War, obviously, is when the national government is giving federal pensions to soldiers. This is a huge change, really trying to reward them for their service and their sacrifice to the nation or their families. We start to see the rise of big business. This is going to lead to the federal government stepping in to regulate railroads. We see the Depression in terms of really trying the national government taking a much larger role to help the people. We see that changing in World War II as we head from the Depression into World War II. Turning our business economy into a military economy, really creating and women going into the workforce as part of that to really help the common good and help the nation grow and improve. And then all the way to the civil rights era, where the national government is stepping in to block those black codes, to get rid of poll taxes and grandfather clauses, and really trying to keep states from violating the rights of minorities. So we definitely start to see the national government exerting different types of roles in this capacity, and a real changing of that federalism that we talk about in this chapter. What is the future of federalism? Well, we always continue to hear that there's a back and forth. There's always a backlash to the pendulum swinging one way. We hear states' rights in terms of segregation, but also in terms of more freedoms to do what they want. California, a good example with the environmental standards. We've heard Maryland talk about that from education point of view. There's a lot of divisions over how much power the central government should have, how much power the states should have, and that's not likely to change anytime soon. We continue to see this back and forth, the devolution, and then the rise of national government in times of crisis, and then devolution basically starting all over again. So to be continued, we'll see how that all breaks down as we start to look at the branches of government in the next unit, a very exciting unit, a big unit, and a lot of content there. Really looking forward to sharing all of that with you in Unit 2 as we look at the branches of government, starting out with Congress, leading into the executive branch, then the bureaucracy and the judicial branch. And also we'll be electing a class president and a class vice president, and a Congress, a Speaker of the House, and a Sergeant at Arms. Some really great times. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Live the 5 on this coming up quiz and test, and we will see you in class. Have a great day.